Peace and greetings, peace and blessings. I pray all is doing well. I don't have, at this moment, I have a working title for this post. And it hasn't come to me yet, so I have a working title. But what prompted it, I was watching an interview with Nate Parker, the brother who did the movie Nat Turner, or Birth of a Nation, I believe it's called. And he was making his rounds, so that was the time period in which the interview was being conducted. And he was speaking, he was on a show being hosted, he was going via satellite, and in studio, he was, the host had, of note, he had this African-American, she had this African-American brother, this European brother who was a police expert, potentially former police or law enforcement, and another European brother. And it was quite interesting, the dynamic. So the gist of the interview, Nate Parker was speaking about police brutality as it relates to African Americans and Black Lives Matter and such. And he was pointing out at the time, it was Mike Brown. So it must have been around the time Mike Brown was killed, and the conversation around that murder by rogue police, as I like to call them. And as he was explaining it, excuse me, the African-American brother was giving him pushback and was saying, well, look, it's about, we as Black people have to pull ourselves up by the bootstrap. We have to stop feeling sorry for ourselves, and so on and so forth. And they got in a nice dialogue, and eventually Nate Parker got him to understand where he was coming from. So that brother, he relaxed with his comments. But the reason I bring it up, it was quite interesting to watch the initial conversation between the two European brothers, because the one who was the police expert made a comment saying, well, it was a bad decision made. And initially, in context, you would think that he was talking about the police officers, but actually he was talking about Mike Brown, which then prompted the other European brother to go in on him, saying, well, how can you say that? You know, Black people have been facing X, Y, and Z from blah, 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 blah. So he made his point, but that didn't deter the other European brother, who was a police expert, quasi or slash, possibly, I believe he was ex-police law enforcement. So his purpose was to go in on that Nate Parker. So they start having a dialogue, and it was lengthy, but in essence, what the police officer, I'm just going to say law enforcement person, said was that Michael Brown made a bad decision, and because of that, he should have complied, and because he didn't comply, that cost him his life. And I thought that was, I was going to say odd, but not odd, but I just sat back and said, this is quite interesting that one would go that route. And then it prompted me to think about some debates I've had in the past with peers of mine, and they are very intelligent, but yet their position, I'll just say it this way, in going back and forth in particular conversations with this friend of mine, I stopped him and said, you know, there's nothing worse than to watch an intelligent person try to intellectualize the indefensible. And that's what came to mind as I watched this law enforcement officer try to intellectualize Michael Brown being killed based upon his bad decision, because he didn't comply to the law enforcement officers who were telling him whatever they were telling him, instructing him to do. Which then caused another thought saying, well, wait a minute. The onus of controlling a situation should be based upon those who are in authority. So if you're in authority, that means you have a certain training, you have a certain expertise on how to handle given situations within the sphere or the circumference of your or one's job or employment. So, for example, as an educator, and I've taught in classrooms, you may have, and one could say this is this watered down scenario, it's not life and death, but it still speaks to authority figure. Being in a classroom, and those of you who are educators can attest to this, and you may have a student who is not complying or not behaving or in harmony with the instruction for the day. But as the educator or as the authority figure in the room, the educator must then navigate the situation and de-escalate it to either remove the student or have the student removed without harm to the student or self or other students, or de-escalate it to where then the student starts to comply and then be in harmony with the class and not be a disruption. So as a law enforcement, they go through training. And it is for scenarios of how to deal with or interact with potential criminals, civilians, if you will, to make it simplistic. So I found it odd that the onus, that this law enforcement person put the onus solely on Michael Brown, and we can expand it because he said he didn't comply. And if he would have complied and didn't make the bad decision of not complying, then he potentially, the outcome would be different. And Michael Brown, I will say this, Nate Parker would say, how would you know that? You weren't there. None of us were there. You can't say that. And that pretty much how it ended because they ran out of time. So I smiled and I said, that's quite interesting because Brother Philando Castile did comply. He followed the book. The officer, he was stopped. The car was stopped. He was a passenger. The officer asked for identification. He calmly said to the officer that he has a weapon in the car and he's licensed to carry and he has identification. And as he went to show him the identification, the officer shoots him. So where was the bad decision on his part? So again, intellectualizing the indefensible. So I bring this up on how do we have solutions, because we're talking about, or the talk now is since George Floyd, on race relations, how to make it better. What do? We start with owning where we are. When you go into the doctor and you say your knee, part of your body is ailing you, they don't just treat you. They find out, they deal with your history and then see what can work with for you and your body and your system. And then they prescribe, and then you start working towards healing of the ailment. So if we're going to have substantive correction, substantive growth from our racial problem that we have in this country, we must look at the history. We must speak towards what historically, how law enforcement was created and initially how it was imposed upon Africans who were enslaved. And this continued to evolve into that, I was going to say overseer, but not overseer, but the, I was going to say not stopping a movement, but regulating of movement. Questioning, who are you, where are you going, what are you doing here, from back then. So if we own it and we're honest about that history, then we can start to have real substantive conversation about solutions, critically thinking and addressing the dehumanization of the African, quote, so-called black man and woman, to where then we can speak towards that. Because once we start humanizing or making humane or human Africans, then you have the potential, there's the potential to then fall in suit and accordingly conduct behavior in this context with law enforcement in a humane manner. Just wanted to share that. Drop those jewels. So, critically thinking, focus to help grow, I was going to say a more perfect union, but not a more perfect union, but a better interaction amongst people. So we can all help to, quote, live through and grow this experiment we call democracy within the United States and make it, because it has the potential to be great and grow, to have all input put in from all peoples so that we can live out the words that are written in the Constitution and in other documents that people in this country hold dear. Hotep. Wakanda forever. Vitamin D is starting to get warm. We're in March, so we're moving towards the warmth. So get that outside air. It helps. Laugh a lot. Hotep.